Some of the naughtiest freight cars on the whole railway live at the works. This is where the engines are mended, so as you can imagine, there is lots of rubbish to be transported. Every so often, one of the engines has to take the scrap iron to the yard, where Edward first met Trevor before he moved to the vicarage orchard. The engines nicknamed the train the Scrap. None of the engines liked the job. The freight cars were old, rude, and noisy. They took absolutely no notice of anything that was said to them. This is not unusual, but these cars were worse than most, and they made every engine's journey a misery. One day, Boko found that he had to take the scrap. "Right," he said to Douglas, who happened to be in the shed with him. "I'm having no nonsense from those freight cars. They'll come quietly, or else." "Aye," smiled Douglas. "Show 'em who's boss." The freight cars objected to Boko because he was a diesel. "What's this green thing?" they asked. "A caterpillar?" Then they accused Boko of bumping them. It was what they deserved, but Boko had been very careful with the freight cars. Finally, they pretended their brakes were still on and screamed horribly when Boko tried to move them. At last, Boko had had enough. "Right," he said to the freight cars. "Any more nonsense, and this trip to the scrapyard will be your last. I'll leave you there to be cut up with the other old iron if you don't start behaving." The cars were silent for the first time that morning. But not for long. One of the oldest freight cars began to complain that it felt ill. Boko didn't believe it. But the freight cars made such a fuss that he had to do something. Growling fiercely, Boko moved around the other freight cars and coupled up to the old car, who was grumbling terribly. "Come on, you," grunted Boko. "Move!" But before they had moved an inch, there was a splintering noise. "Yow!" screeched the car. Suddenly, its floor gave way. The scrap iron it was carrying fell through and landed with a loud crash on the rails below. "Oh!" groaned the poor old car and collapsed. So, Boko really did have to leave a car to be broken up for the next scrap train. The other freight cars were very worried, as they didn't want to be turned into scrap iron. They were quiet and helpful for the rest of the day, and it was the easiest run Boko ever had with the scrap.